Tonight, I want to take you inside one of the most unusual diplomatic exchanges of the modern era. A private conversation that may have quietly brought an end to President Donald Trump's year-long fixation with absorbing Canada into the United States as its 51st state. The person who apparently stopped him was not a senator, a general, a prime minister, or a single American official. He was King Charles III, the constitutional head of state of Canada, and a figure Trump has openly admired over the years in public remarks. What transpired between these two men, according to a forthcoming book by one of Britain's most respected royal biographers, is the kind of account that reframes how we understand power, personal relationships, and the fragility of national sovereignty in 2026. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear changes the entire picture of how the annexation threat actually ended. For more than a year, I watched Trump describe the border between the United States and Canada as an artificial line that served no real purpose. I watched him speculate, sometimes with a tone of casual amusement, sometimes with the weight of a genuine policy proposal, about incorporating a sovereign nation of 40 million people into the American Union. He called Canada cherished. He suggested Canadians would be materially better off inside the United States. He returned to the 51st state, framing so frequently that it stopped registering as provocation and started registering as intention. Canadians were alarmed. Markets reacted. Prime Minister Mark Carney built an entire governing strategy around defending Canadian sovereignty from a southern neighbor who had become unpredictable in ways no Canadian leader had been trained to manage. And then, according to the forthcoming work of British royal biographer Robert Hardman, something shifted in a room that the public was not watching. Hardman describes in his new book how he personally raised the annexation question with Trump during an interview conducted earlier this year. He told the president directly that any American attempt to absorb Canada would cause King Charles significant personal distress, given that the king remains the constitutional head of state of Canada. By Hardman's account, Trump paused. He appeared genuinely caught off guard. And then he asked a question that reveals more about the actual depth of his understanding of Canadian sovereignty than anything he said publicly across an entire year of annexation rhetoric. He asked whether Canadians still recognize the king. Could you take a moment with that? The most powerful person on earth, who had spent over a year openly floating the idea of swallowing an entire country into his own, apparently had no working knowledge that the country he was threatening shares a monarch with the United Kingdom. He did not know that Canada had sworn allegiance to the crown across generations. He did not know that the face appearing on Canadian currency belonged to the same royal family he had expressed personal warmth toward, Hardman told him. He explained that King Charles is formally recognized as Canada's head of state, that Canada fought beside the Allied forces at Normandy, and that the relationship between Canada and the British Crown runs more than 2 centuries deep. And Trump, for the first time on any available record, said something that constituted an actual acknowledgement. He conceded that Canadians have 200 years of history, that there is the whole "O Canada" dimension to it, and that you cannot erase that. In the segments that follow, I will walk you through how King Charles became the most unlikely diplomatic shield in the modern history of North American politics, why Carney's team engineered a royal moment designed specifically to send a message Washington could not process through conventional diplomatic channels, and why, even with the annexation language fading from Trump's public statements, Canadians remain broadly unconvinced that the underlying threat to their sovereignty has actually passed. I'm going to take you back to the moment that made the king's intervention possible, because none of what followed was accidental. In 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney made a decision that analysts at the time described as either a stroke of strategic creativity or a measure of desperation. He invited King Charles III to deliver the throne speech before the Parliament of Canada. This was not ceremonial courtesy extended to a friendly head of state. This was a calculated sovereignty signal aimed with precision at Donald Trump sitting in the White House. Carney's team had diagnosed something that traditional diplomatic approaches had consistently failed to grasp. Trump did not respond to trade position papers, to diplomatic cables from Ottawa, or to carefully worded official statements. But Trump did respond to the monarchy, to the ceremony, to crowns, and above all, to King Charles personally. The throne speech that followed became one of the most quietly consequential political moments in recent Canadian history. King Charles stood before the Canadian Parliament and spoke aloud the words that would travel far beyond the chamber where they were delivered. He said, "The true North is indeed strong and free." That single phrase, lifted directly from the Canadian national anthem, was not an accidental choice of language. It was a statement delivered by the constitutional head of state of Canada, aimed at Washington, reminding anyone who needed the reminder that this country is not an administrative territory awaiting absorption. It is not a subordinate partner. It is not a vacant star position on another nation's flag. The standing ovation that followed was long, and members of Parliament from across the partisan spectrum rose together in a display of national unity that Canadians had not witnessed in years. What strikes me most about the Carney strategy in retrospect is how precisely it was calibrated to Trump's specific emotional vulnerabilities. Trump has spoken on multiple occasions about his genuine admiration for the late Queen Elizabeth II. He has expressed personal warmth toward King Charles. He has described the British royal family in terms he reserves for almost no other foreign institution. Canadian officials noticed this. They understood that a channel of communication existed through the Crown that was unavailable through the State Department, through congressional relationships, or through any form of direct Oval Office negotiation. And so Carney's government engineered a moment designed to make Trump confront the reality that any move against Canada was a move against something King Charles personally cared about. That calculation, it now appears, was correct. Hardman's book documents how the ground laid by Carney made the later conversation possible. When Hardman sat down with Trump for the interview at the center of his book, he was not entering a neutral discussion. He was entering a conversation in which the symbolic weight of the throne speech still hung in the background. Trump's admiration for the king was already established, and the question of Canadian sovereignty had been quietly reframed as a matter of personal respect for the British monarchy. Hardman used that reframing deliberately. He told Trump directly that the king would be deeply troubled by any annexation attempt. He walked Trump through Canada's presence at Normandy. He drew a picture of 2 centuries of shared history between Canada and the Crown that no American president could casually dissolve by describing the northern border as artificial. Trump's response, as Hardman documents, represents the first public acknowledgement by this president that Canadian identity is real, carries historical weight, and cannot be dismantled by executive declaration or sustained rhetorical pressure. He conceded the 200 years of history. He conceded the emotional depth of O Canada. He conceded that Canada is not a blank space on a geopolitical map, but a nation with collective memory, with ceremony, with a monarch, and with a claim to sovereignty that precedes the modern American republic itself. That concession carries enormous significance. I want to be careful here, because what Trump said in that private conversation can only be understood against the backdrop of what he had been saying publicly for more than a year. For the entire duration of that year, Trump had maintained one of the most aggressive postures toward a peaceful neighbor that any modern American president has adopted. He described the border as artificial. He repeatedly floated the idea of a 51st state in appearances, social media posts, interviews, and conversations with foreign leaders. He delivered it sometimes as humor and sometimes with the cadence of genuine policy, and Canadians could never determine with confidence which version he actually believed. The consequences of that sustained uncertainty were real and measurable. Canadian consumer confidence contracted. The Canadian dollar weakened. Investment decisions across multiple industries were placed on hold. Canadian companies began quietly restructuring their supply chains to reduce exposure to the American market. Provincial governments began developing contingency frameworks that would have been politically inconceivable 2 years earlier. And across the country, ordinary Canadians began asking a question that no living generation had seriously confronted before. What actually happens if the United States decides it no longer accepts Canada's existence as a separate sovereign nation? That is the landscape into which King Charles, according to Hardman's account, stepped as an unlikely pivot point. When Hardman told Trump that the king would be personally distressed by an annexation attempt, Trump did not wave off the concern. He did not redirect to his standard talking points about Canadian trade imbalances, Arctic vulnerability, or the artificiality of the northern border. He paused. He asked whether Canadians still recognized the king. And when told that yes, King Charles serves as Canada's constitutional head of state, Trump absorbed that information and adjusted his framing in the moment. His acknowledgement that Canada possesses 200 years of history and all that O Canada dimension that cannot simply be erased represents, by my reading, one of the most significant quiet retreats of his second term. This is a president who, as a general rule, does not walk things back. This is a president whose political identity is built around doubling down. This is a president who treats any concession of ground as an institutional weakness. And yet, in a private conversation with a British royal biographer, he acknowledged that Canadian identity is real, durable, and beyond absorption. The mechanism that produced that acknowledgement was not trade leverage, not diplomatic pressure, not congressional intervention, and not his own cabinet. It was King Charles. What Hardman describes is essentially a case of the British monarchy functioning as an informal diplomatic buffer between Washington and Ottawa, a role the modern crown has been careful to avoid for decades. The monarchy has maintained a deliberate distance from any form of political intervention in Commonwealth affairs. But the annexation threat was sufficiently destabilizing, unusual, and connected to Trump's emotional architecture that the king, wittingly or not, became the only figure capable of reaching him. His constitutional relationship with Canada, combined with Trump's personal regard for the crown, created an opening that Canadian diplomats had spent a year seeking through every conventional channel and had consistently failed to find. Hardman's book will almost certainly be read in Ottawa as a validation of the Carney strategy. And yet, I would like to be direct with you about something important. The annexation rhetoric may have quietly died in a private exchange about respect for King Charles. But the underlying pressure on Canadian sovereignty has not gone anywhere. It has changed its form. A January Ipsos poll found that 56% of Canadians either strongly or somewhat agreed that the United States would never completely rule out a military move against Canada. 56%. Could you sit with that figure? A majority of Canadians now believe their closest neighbor, their largest commercial partner, and their continental ally of nearly 2 centuries might one day contemplate using military force against them. That level of foundational mistrust would have been unthinkable before Trump's return to the White House. The trade conflict between the two countries continues without resolution. Tariffs remain in place on Canadian aluminum, lumber, automotive components, and a broadening range of goods. Canadian exporters are absorbing losses that smaller businesses cannot sustain over the medium term. The Canadian dollar remains under sustained pressure. Cross-border infrastructure investment has slowed materially, and Trump, even as the formal 51st state language has quieted in his public statements, has reportedly not stopped raising concerns privately about what he describes as Canada's Arctic exposure. He has reportedly told advisors that the Canadian Arctic is inadequately defended, that it holds strategic significance for American interests, and that Ottawa is not doing enough to protect a region Washington considers critical. That is a different category of pressure from the annexation campaign, but it is sustained pressure nonetheless. More troubling still is the reported engagement between the Trump administration and Alberta separatist leaders. Alberta, Canada's oil-rich western province, has long carried a vocal independence movement, and elements of that movement have openly entertained the idea that Alberta might be better aligned with the United States than within the Canadian Federation. Direct American engagement with those figures represents a destabilization approach that bypasses Ottawa entirely and requires no annexation language to be effective. It does not need the 51st state framing. It only requires the patient to sustain the fracturing of Canadian federal cohesion from the inside. And if that strategy is maintained over time, it could prove considerably more dangerous to Canadian sovereignty than anything Trump said publicly across a year of annexation rhetoric. Prime Minister Mark Carney now occupies a position no Canadian Prime Minister has had to navigate before. He has successfully neutralized the most visible and explicit version of the American threat, the rhetorical campaign to absorb Canada outright. But he has done so only to discover that the threat has redistributed itself across a set of smaller, more diffuse, more difficult to confront pressures. He cannot invite King Charles to deliver a sovereignty-signaling throne speech every 6 months. He cannot indefinitely depend on the personal chemistry between Trump and the British Crown as a diplomatic backstop. He must build structural economic resilience, institutional political unity, and long-term diversification that can withstand American pressure without depending on the continued goodwill of any individual foreign figure, however strategically useful that figure has proved to be. What Hardman's book ultimately surfaces is therefore a picture with two edges. Yes, a private conversation conducted in the context of a royal biography may have brought the 51st state obsession to a quiet end. Yes, King Charles appears to have played a role that no conventional diplomatic instrument could replicate. Yes, the Carney strategy of using the crown as a sovereignty signal aimed at Trump's emotional register appears, on the available evidence, to have worked. But the more serious structural threat to Canada has not been resolved. It has simply shifted from the loud, declarative pressure of annexation rhetoric to the quieter, slower, more corrosive tactics of economic leverage, Arctic strategic concern, and deliberate engagement with the fault lines inside Canadian federalism. Carney must now manage a threat that has changed its shape rather than disappeared from the landscape. As I bring this account to a close, I want to step back and consider what the entire episode reveals about the nature of power and diplomatic practice in 2026. We are living through a moment when the traditional instruments of international statecraft, treaties, formal alliances, institutional relationships, and diplomatic protocols appear to carry less operational weight than the personal dynamics between specific individual leaders. The fact that King Charles III, a constitutional monarch holding no direct political authority over any government's decisions, may have achieved what an entire generation of Canadian professional diplomats could not tells us something genuinely significant about how the most consequential decisions are actually being made at the apex of global politics right now. Trump responded to King Charles not because any treaty compelled it, not because any institution required it, not because any formal diplomatic channel demanded it. He responded because of a personal and symbolic connection that bypassed every conventional mechanism of international engagement. That is simultaneously reassuring and deeply unsettling. Reassuring because it demonstrates that even the most unpredictable political actors can be reached when the right emotional register is identified and activated. Unsettling because it means the sovereignty of a nation of 40 million people with its own parliament, its own history, and its own centuries-old identity can pivot on the personal chemistry between an American president and a British monarch. That is not how a stable international order is designed to function. For Canadians absorbing this story, the honest assessment is that whatever relief this account provides should be accompanied by sustained vigilance. The rhetoric of the 51st state is receding from Trump's public vocabulary. The formal annexation campaign appears to have been set aside. Trump's language about incorporating Canada has grown measurably quieter since the Hardman conversation. These are real shifts, and they matter. But the economic pressure has not lifted. The Arctic strategic concerns have not been resolved. The engagement with Alberta separatists has not stopped. The 56% of Canadians who fear a potential American military move have not changed their assessment, and the structural asymmetry of power between a nation of 40 million and a nation of 340 million has not shifted in any direction. Carney's task in the months ahead is to consolidate the diplomatic opening that King Charles helped create, while simultaneously constructing the durable structural foundations that Canada needs to withstand pressure from any future American administration, whether led by Trump or by whoever comes after him. That means genuine trade diversification away from the American market, a goal Canada has announced and deferred repeatedly across decades, but has never fully executed. It means building Arctic defense capabilities strong enough that American complaints about Canadian vulnerability lose their strategic credibility. It means addressing the legitimate frustrations of Alberta and other Western provinces before Washington finds ways to exploit them as pressure points against federal unity. And it means investing seriously in the kind of national narrative and institutional confidence that makes the idea of absorption unthinkable, not only to American presidents, but to any future generation of Canadians who might ever find themselves questioning whether the country is worth the work of defending. The larger lesson I carry from this extraordinary episode is that Canadian sovereignty, far from being a settled historical given, now requires active, deliberate, continuous defense in ways it has not demanded since the country's formative decades. King Charles may have purchased Canada for a meaningful time. Carney's throne speech strategy may have created the diplomatic opening that enabled the king's intervention. Hardman's conversation may have been the decisive moment that ended the fixation on the 51st state. But time is the only thing any of this has secured. What Canada does with that time, how it strengthens itself economically, unifies itself politically, and prepares itself for pressures that have not yet arrived, will determine whether this moment is recorded in history as the turning point that secured Canadian sovereignty for the next generation, or merely as a pause in a longer and considerably more dangerous story that is still writing itself across the northern half of this continent.